Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalan Johnson. My guest today is Genesis Gomez. Genesis is a psychotherapist and the owner of Healing Connections, an online private practice servicing all of Florida. Genesis holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in mental health counseling, is a level 3 Gottman Trained Couples Therapist, and has been featured on Oprah Daily. Genesis helps college students and young adults adjust to their life transitions, navigate the dating world, manage relationship issues, set boundaries with family, and develop adult friendships. Genesis also works with couples through all the stages of their relationship and is passionate about helping people improve their relationships with themselves and others. So Genesis, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little better, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah. It's hard to follow that introduction, but I am a licensed therapist in Florida. I have a small virtual practice. And like you mentioned in the introduction, I mostly see clients going through major life transitions. And a lot of those life transitions are directly tied to relationships or impact their relationships in some way. And as far as like a little bit more about my background, I am Cuban American, first generation, and growing up, mental health was definitely not something that was really talked about very openly or very freely, and much less the connection between relationships and mental health. And so it's been really interesting to land in a field where I do kind of the complete opposite of what I saw growing up.
So because mental health wasn't something that I guess was something that was discussed for you growing up, how did that affect or not affect your choice to become a therapist?
So I think one of the only reasons, I don't want to say one of the only reasons, but I think, there are experiences that we have in our life that kind of shape us and kind of change the trajectory of our lives. And we probably don't even recognize it while we're living that experience. But when we look back, we're like, yeah, if that didn't happen, I probably wouldn't have done the other thing, right? And so I took an AP psychology class in high school because I wanted AP credits because I wanted to boost my GPA because I knew I was going to go to college. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do in college, but again, being first gen, the push for higher education, it was a given that I was going to college. And so in this AP psychology class, my mind was just kind of blown away by everything that I learned. And just by some of the conversations that were naturally had in that environment of the classroom. And then that motivated me to like seek my own therapy as a teenager and kind of like convince my mother, knowing her until she agreed to take me to therapy. And then it kind of all snowballed from there. But again, if I had never taken that AP psychology class, I may have done something completely different with my career.
Okay, so now that you're an adult and a therapist, how does your view of mental health and relationships differ from what you were exposed to growing up?
Well, significantly. I think growing up, I didn't really have an understanding of mental health. I think the notion of mental health was very limited to very severe mental illness, like thinking of people hearing voices and thinking about people attempting suicide and like the very extreme of it. And there was not really a notion of like mental wellness or the fact that we all have mental health the same way that we have physical health, right? So really, I think like to put it into perspective, I think like what I understood or what I knew about mental health was like the size of like a little peanut compared to what I understand now. And when it comes to relationships, I don't think there was a lot of conversations around relationships. Like you were in these relationships, you have relationships to family members, you have friends, you date, you eventually want to be in a relationship. You see these people that are married and in these committed relationships, but there was never like really a conversation about how do we improve relationships, right? How do we seek to have healthier relationships? How do we date smart? Like there was never really conversations about it, if that makes sense. And much less the link between mental health and relationships. There was never a conversation about these two influencing each other in any way.
So, on the topic of relationships, what is the dating scene like nowadays, and what challenges might some people encounter?
I think it can be complicated. And I think it depends on different things. I think like geographically where you might be might kind of make a difference to a certain degree. I think there's a different experience of like dating in a small town versus dating in a big city. But I think across the board, my clients, whether they are 19 or they're 49, if they're single and they're dating, they are struggling. I think after the pandemic, after COVID, we have seen a complete shift to online dating apps. And although dating apps have been around for a while, probably a little bit over a decade, I think after the pandemic, it was like a complete boom where people expect to date through a dating app and not necessarily by meeting someone at a bar or at the gym or at some other kind of location where people congregate. And so this kind of full reliance on dating apps, I think also a lack of even not just communication skills, but just like social skills. And I think there's some of that has been lost because so much of our lives are consumed on screens, right? And it's not being like anti-technology. The technology is going to continue to evolve, and that's kind of where the world is going, and that's not a bad thing in itself. But because we're always attached to screens, like if you think about it, a lot of kids have tablets in school, and like their books, right? And their homework assignments are in these tablets. So in school for 8 hours, you're using their tablets for academic purposes. Then they come home and they have homework that they also need to use their tablets for. And then when they're finally done with homework, they're using their tablet to like play games and watch things to relax. So there's really not a lot of opportunities, I think, sometimes to develop social skills, and without the developed social skills and communication skills also get hurt. And what I mean by those social skills is, I mean, if we're kind of talking, I can't just like stop talking to you and then talk to you 3 days later without anything in between and just kind of drop a conversation. So I think there's some of that's missing that kind of makes it a little bit complicated. I think there's also like, we've gone, I think, to the other side of the pendulum when it comes to hookup culture. And so a lot of what I see is people catching feelings, but not knowing what to do with these feelings because they're just supposed to be hooking up and they're just supposed to be chill and relax. And please, I cannot be seen as clingy. God forbid I'm perceived as clingy, right? I have to be very chill and nonchalant. And so I think a lot of, especially when I think about Gen Z clients, which are now like in their mid 20s, early mid 20s. Some of them are getting closer to 30 now. Some of them have never experienced a relationship, like a formal, actual committed relationship, because the norm since they were growing up in high school was to have these very nonchalant encounters with people and to not be vulnerable, not express emotions, not catch feelings. If you catch feelings, you keep it to themselves. And so we have like older young adults, if that makes sense, that are really lacking in that relationship department because one, it hasn't been modeled for them and by peers, people close in age. Maybe it was modeled by parents, but not by people close in age to them. And two, like it's been ingrained in them that they need to be chill, nonchalant, not catch feelings, not be vulnerable, don't be perceived as clingy, etc., etc. So vulnerability is key to relationships. Communication is key to relationships, and they're missing that.
That was a wonderful explanation. So something else you believe is that we're only healthy as our relationships are. What exactly do you mean by that?
So I don't think that there is mental health without relational wellness. And when I'm talking about relationships, I'm talking about relationships in general. I'm not just talking about romantic relationships. I'm talking about the relationship you have with your parents, with your children, with your siblings, with your friends, with your employees, with your cubicle buddy, with your workout buddy, right? All these different relationships that we have in our life, some of them we might hold closer to us than others, but they all form part of our mental health. And when our relationships are struggling, it impacts our mental health. So if you think about a time where you were maybe in a toxic relationship, let's think about a romantic relationship for this example. When you think back at that period of time, your mental health probably took a hit. Maybe it was your self-esteem that was impacted by being in this toxic relationship. Maybe, you had some thoughts of worthlessness, of not being good enough, being inadequate. Maybe this toxic relationship made you feel very insecure, made you feel very hyper vigilant and always not knowing, walking on eggshells. Maybe you had a lot of anxiety. Maybe you isolated from other people in your life because you were so consumed by the intensity of this relationship. But when we look back at a period in time where we were in a toxic relationship, romantic relationship for this example, it was never just about that relationship. And it was never just about I'm upset and I have these feelings about this relationship, but then I can just shut them off when I leave the house and I can go into all these other areas of my life and function perfectly fine as if nothing was happening. The intensity of that relationship carries over to your other roles in life. And then the flip side of that is when we are struggling with our mental health. So let's say that perhaps we're struggling with depression and we're maybe having some feelings of worthlessness. Maybe we are isolating ourselves from others because we feel like a burden. And maybe we're just really struggling with life. We're feeling really sad, really overwhelmed, really unmotivated. When we have healthy relationships in our life, they serve as a protective factor. So these people in our life are going to call us out. They're going to realize there's something off with us. They're going to encourage us to do things that bring us joy. They're going to be supportive and they're going to lend a listening ear and an arm to cry on. And just knowing that they are there is going to help us in getting out of this depressive state. I mean, we might need therapy, we might need medication, we might need other sources of support. It's not all on the relationship, but the relationships that we have that are healthy are key to help us get to a better state when our mental health is struggling.
It's kind of like a support group if you have healthy
Absolutely.
relationships.
Absolutely.
Right. What do you see your clients coping with most often, and what treatment approach do you use to help?
Mm-hmm. I would say it'd be a combination of things. I think some of my clients definitely struggle with either dating or the romantic relationship that they are in. I think some of my clients struggle setting boundaries and kind of redefining their relationship with family members. I have clients that definitely struggle with friendships as adults, whether it's kind of staying in touch with old friends or making new friends. That can be challenging as adults. And I think overall, my clients struggle typically with things like perfectionism, parentification, and just a lot of insecure attachment.
Let's see. A question I wanted to ask, and I think that this may be very pervasive in relationships, because if people had a difficult childhood or there wasn't a lot of safety or emotional stability as a child, how can someone's childhood affect how they show up in a relationship later on in life as an adult?
So I guess the first thing is that it always affects the way that you show up as an adult, whether you're aware of it or not. So if you are aware of it, you might be overcompensating, right? So it might be I know I had this terrible experience in childhood and I never want to feel this way again or find myself in that situation, or I would never want to parent my child that way, or I would never want to be in a relationship where this happened again. So you do everything possible to steer clear from anything that might even resemble what you experienced in childhood in your adult life. right? So there would be a degree of awareness there. I think sometimes there isn't awareness and we're just kind of repeating patterns. And so we recreate a lot of what we hated in our childhood, in our adult lives, because that's just what we know at a subconscious level.
Wow. So it's something that we want to avoid, but by trying so hard to avoid it, we actually recreate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I guess that's kind of like similar to an intrusive thought. You try to avoid thinking about something, but you put so much energy into trying to avoid it. You're really focusing on it.
Mm-hmm. And so, I think a common example can be, maybe I don't want to be in a relationship. So maybe my parents had a relationship where I felt like my mom didn't have a voice in that relationship, right? And I felt like maybe my dad was the one calling all the shots. And I grew up seeing that and saying I would never be in a relationship where my partner calls all the shots and I have no voice, right? But if I am not like aware of how I'm creating or what patterns would lead me to recreate this whole situation, this whole dynamic in my adult life, from that dynamic, I learned to be a people pleaser, right? Because I learned it was just better to survive in that dynamic to be a people pleaser, because that's what my mom was doing. By letting my dad call all the shots, she was being a people pleaser. And although I didn't like that about her, that's what I saw and that's what I learned, right? And so now in my adult relationships, when I'm dating, when I'm in a relationship, I'm a people pleaser. So I'm not vulnerable. I don't call out people and things I don't like. I don't bring up red flags and say like, hey, that didn't sit well with me. Like, let's talk about that. I don't have hard conversations. I'm not vulnerable. I'm not transparent in my communication because I didn't learn how to do that. I never saw that modeled at home. So there's a high likelihood that I am going to end up in a relationship where I feel that I don't have a voice. And maybe my partner's a tyrant. Maybe they're not. Maybe it's just I'm not using my voice. But I end up in a similar dynamic, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It made perfect sense. And it is very deep how these cycles can continue, even if it's something that you really want to avoid or you're conscious of and you try hard to not repeat it. It still can be a thing.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to kind of circle back to that, parentification. Mm-hmm. What is parentification? And if someone was parentified, how might it play a role in how they feel about their needs getting met in a relationship?
So parentification is at any time that a child is given a responsibility, and this can be an emotional responsibility. This can be a task-oriented responsibility that is above their developmental level or their developmental capacity. So if I ask like a 5-year-old to take care of a 3-year-old, that would be beyond their developmental capacity. If I used my 15-year-old teenage child as my confidant and I went to them about my own emotional crisis, maybe about my relationship with their parent, maybe about my like self-esteem or like issues that I am dealing with, that would be parentification, because a 15-year-old cannot play therapist to their adult parent. No matter how mature they may seem, no matter how great of a listener they may be, they cannot play therapist to their adult parent. So it can be like a household chore or a task, right? Or it can be something of like an emotional demand. And what happens when people are grown in a parentified situation, and I want to clarify that like not all parents intentionally parentify their child or parentify their child because like they're lazy. A lot of times it's life circumstances that kind of land us in those situations, like where maybe one of the parents is chronically ill and it's in and out of the hospital and there's multiple siblings. The older sibling might have to take some responsibilities around the household that are maybe not appropriate for their age, but there's just like no one else to do it, right? So there can be definitely situations where it's not intentional, but it still happens and it still has an impact on that child that then becomes an adult. And so when that child becomes an adult, what they've learned from this parentification is that they have to work to earn love. Love is just not deserved, given, or unconditional. they have to work to deserve love. So they tend to find themselves in relationships, and not just romantic relationships, but even friendships and even like work relationships, where they're working extra hard to earn love. And these tend to be one-sided relationships, right? Because you're not necessarily expecting that the other person is going to invest much in the relationship dynamic. They are the ones I feel like, no, I need your love, or I need your approval because I'm not worthy of it. So I'm going to do this, this, and that to constantly show you that I am deserving of this relationship. And even when these relationships are not one-sided, because maybe like the other person is a healthy person, they have a hard time being receptive when people are showing them love, because they don't feel like, again, they just deserve nice gestures of love. They feel like they constantly have to be working towards them to earn them.
Well, I think that with all of the things that we discussed and a lot of the character traits that may come out in a relationship, you don't tend to see these in the beginning of a relationship. So what I wanted to ask is, do people tend to put their best foot forward at the start of a relationship?
So yes. And I don't think it's always a negative thing. Like, I don't think it comes from a place of malice or a place of trying to manipulate other people. But I think, like, on the first day of school, we go with our best uniform and our hair is done and we have new shoes, and, all of our folders are perfect and pretty and color coordinated. And when it's our first day at a new job, like, we're there 30 minutes before our time and we are like all set and we look all polished and like we're super excited, right? I think that's what we tend to do as human beings. I think that's part of our nature. Can some people take it up a notch and be manipulative? Of course. But I think overall that is our human nature. I also think some of these behaviors and traits that you were talking about, they can only come up when there's a level of investment or a level of feelings, right? If I don't have any feelings for a person, I don't necessarily care if they approve of me or not, or I'm not necessarily trying to earn their approval or their love, right? I'm not trying to prove myself because I don't really care. They're a random person in the street. But if all of a sudden that person is my boss, or if all of a sudden that person is someone that I really want to be friends with because I feel like we have a lot of things in common and I think they're cool and I would really want to be friends with them, or if all of a sudden that's someone that I am physically attracted to and that I would want to explore what's there with them, then that changes things, right? And the moment that I begin to invest more into any of these relationships, the more I'm going to want that approval, the more that I'm going to want to earn that love, that whatever the case may be, the more challenging it's going to be for me to be receptive to any gestures, positive gestures that these people may do towards, the relationship that I have with them. I guess what I'm trying to say with this is that our triggers are only going to come up when we are invested in these relationships. So if I'm just meeting someone on a first date that I met off an app and I have no background on this person, it was just, an attractive photo and maybe a funny thing they shared in their bio, it's a pretty low risk for a trigger. But if this is maybe date number 4 and now I'm like, there's definitely some things that I really like about this person and there's some sort of a connection and I have invested and want to invest more, then now I'm getting to a place where my triggers are ready to come up.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. Something that you posted, and I wanted to quote your post, it said, relationships don't usually end due to a lack of love. They tend to end because partners don't know how to love each other well. Loving someone well is a learning process that requires uncomfortable conversations, putting our pride aside, and lots of vulnerability, among other things. Can you kind of unpack that and tie it in with what you were just talking about how we become invested?
Yeah. So most of the individuals and couples that I work with, when they decide to end a relationship, most of the time they're suffering because they still love that person. They still care about that person and it hurts them that by ending, let's say they're the ones choosing to end the relationship, that by ending the relationship, they're causing the other person hurt, right? Yet, what drives someone to make that decision is feeling exhausted by this just toxic dynamic where their needs are not being met and they're not being loved in the way that they're asking they need to be loved, right? When someone tells you, I need you to spend more time with me, or I need you to communicate, or I need you to do this, or I need you to do that, they are giving you the recipe of how to love them well. And you might miss an ingredient here and you might still get like a yummy pumpkin pie if you forget to add cinnamon to it. But if you forget to add pumpkin to the pumpkin pie, it's not pumpkin pie anymore, right? So we're not perfect and we're never going to be perfect. But the idea is, if I'm giving you this recipe of what I need you to do to make me feel loved, and time again, you fail to follow this recipe, you fail to use the key ingredients for this recipe, and no matter how I explain the recipe to you, you continue to fail to do that, it gets toxic and it gets really exhausting. And this happens both ways. It usually doesn't just happen one way. It usually happens both ways. But then we get stuck in this place where we both feel like our needs are not being met. And we're stuck in this like negative loop of like, I won't do something for you because you're not doing anything that I want for me, right? And so we get stuck in this negative loop. And it's not impossible to break out of this negative loop. I think the longer we're in it, the more challenging it is, because we are creatures of habit. And, I think if you're in that negative loop for a long time, you are probably building a lot of resentment, and resentment can be very challenging in relationships, but it's not impossible. If we are able to have tough conversations, if we're able to be vulnerable, if we're able to put pride aside, if we're able to be flexible in like our thinking and our understanding, if we have a degree of willingness to maybe do things outside of our comfort zone, or consider other people's experiences and know that my experience is not the only experience, we could probably work a lot of couples, relationships, situations, issues out. And we could break away from that negative cycle. But it takes two to be able to do that.
I think this kind of leads in perfectly to my next question, which is, if one person in the relationship feels like they're doing work and they're growing, is it difficult to stay connected in a long-term relationship during periods of personal and professional growth if the growth makes someone feel like they're leaving their partner behind?
It can be. And I think this makes usually both partners a little bit nervous, right? Because when you see that your significant other is really investing in their own personal growth, and maybe for them that looks like going to therapy, maybe for them that looks like different things, but you are seeing that investment on their end and you're seeing these changes, it can be like, wait, hold on, like who are you, right? And so I think it can create a lot of anxiety on both ends. I think the key thing is communication. Your partner, it's okay for us to grow at a different pace. Your partner is not always going to be right next to you. And it's even okay if we slightly grow into different directions, not significantly, but like slightly, because we're different individuals with different personalities, different desires, different goals, different thought processes, and different interests. So we don't always have to be like attached to the hip, doing everything at the same pace and going towards the same direction. But I think the key is communication, being able to share what we're learning, what we're doing, how we're growing, how this is impacting us with our partner, and our partner being receptive instead of feeling threatened by our growth, being receptive to hear and in some way be part of this experience. Think about it as if you go and take a trip without your significant other, right? A way of staying connected and like making your partner part of your experience would be to like send them photos and videos of where you are and like, oh, today we went to the Eiffel Tower. Like, look at this video from the Eiffel Tower. Look at the view from the Eiffel Tower. And look, this is the croissant that I ate, right? And kind of making them a part of that experience, even if they're not physically there. Now, they're not physically there, so you're not making memories with them, right? They're not sharing this experience with you in the flesh, but they can still be part of this experience if you share some of this experience with them. Now, for you to feel inclined to share this experience with them, they have to be like receptive and open, right? If they're making, like nasty comments or taking jabs at like your photos by the Eiffel Tower, you're not going to continue to send photos, right? If it feels like they're resentful and there's just kind of a little hurt that they're not there with you, you're not going to send photos. But if they're like, oh my gosh, that's beautiful, that looks delicious, I'm so glad you're having the time of your life, you're going where tomorrow, you're going to Versailles, please send me photos of Versailles, then you are inclined to send those photos.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, you wouldn't do something for somebody if they didn't show appreciation for it, or if in doing it you got rejected, because that would make you shut down.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so another question: what is codependency, and what can it look like in a relationship?
So one, codependency can exist in any kind of relationship. So it can be in a romantic relationship, it can be in a parent-child relationship, it can be in a sibling relationship, it can be in a friendship relationship, it can exist in any relationship. I would even say that most people that are codependent in most of their relationships, or at least in the closest relationships that they have. So they would be codependent in their romantic relationship, and they would maybe be codependent with their best friend, so to speak. And the idea of codependency is that I lack a sense of self. My sense of self is my relationship. So if you ask someone that's codependent, what's your favorite TV show? They're going to say the other person's favorite TV show. If you ask someone that's codependent, what do you like to do in their free time? Oh, I like to do so-and-so. I like to do this and that with so-and-so. It's always back to the person that they're in a relationship with. It's very hard for them to be able to be able to answer questions about themselves, their likes, their dislikes, what they agree with, what they disagree with, what they're for, what they're not for, based on themselves, without bringing in someone else that they're in a relationship with. And so what you'll see is that most of these people do almost everything together. And I'm going to say like the exception of work and school, because that's, you don't always work with your partner, and you definitely cannot go to school with your child. But outside from like work and school, they basically do everything together. So if they play tennis, they don't have friends that they play tennis with, perhaps. They play tennis with this one friend, or they play tennis with their partner, right? If they are into anything, like they're into that because this person that they're in a codependent relationship with is into it as well. And so they'll do that, and they might socialize with other people that are present in doing that activity, but they're going because the person they're in a codependent relationship with is going, not because of the other people. And if that person wasn't able to go, they would not go. And if there's ever a situation where there's distance or there's space from the person they're in a codependent relationship with, that creates an enormous amount of anxiety, right? Because it's like, who am I if I'm not with them? Like what can I do if I'm not with them? And what are they doing if they're not with me? How can they be having fun, or how can they be enjoying themselves if like I'm struggling because I'm not with them? Like, why are they not suffering in the same way that I'm suffering? Or why would they choose to do something without me, right? And this can be very challenging because it creates a very toxic dynamic. I would say that for a long-term relationship to survive long-term, both partners would have to be codependent. And even in a friendship, like both friends would have to be codependent. If you have someone that's codependent and someone that's not codependent, that's not going to last very long unless a codependent person starts working on themselves. Because that person that's healthy is going to be like, yeah, I like spending time with you, and I like having activities that we do together. And I also like my personal space. And I also like having other friends. And I also like doing things that I do on my own, right? And so when that healthy partner says that, the codependent person is going to freak out. And that would probably lead to the end of the relationship, again, unless that codependent person realizes, okay, there's something off with me. Like, let me figure out why I get so much anxiety, and let me figure out why I can't be happy and be fulfilled and find other activities and other relationships that bring purpose and meaning to my life outside of this one relationship.
Oh, I think I saw codependency referred to once as what you think of me is what I am, or what you think of me
Uh-huh.
is what I think of me, something like that to that
Uh-huh.
effect.
Right.
And
Like
that's
if you
yours.
love me, I think I'm great and I think I'm lovable. But if you're disappointed on me, then I think I'm like the most horrible person on the planet. I'm super disappointing. And
Yeah.
there's no shades of gray to that.
And that can be difficult in a relationship because it doesn't allow for any autonomy or for to be a distinction between the two people. Like, who are you outside of the relationship, or who are you outside of
Mm-hmm.
how I feel about you? You have no identity really
Mm-hmm.
if you're codependent.
Exactly. And
Mm.
again, what makes it so toxic is that that would be true for both people in a long-term relationship or in a long-term friendship. Both people would find their identity in the other person.
Gotcha.
And so it's really hard to break away from that.
Let's see. Well, as a couples therapist, what is some advice that you can give on how to fight fairly, arrive at compromises, and regulate emotions during hot topics?
So I feel like that could be like a whole podcast episode in itself. But I think probably the two main things. One is to remember that your partner is on your side. Like you are a team. There's no my side, their side. You are a team. If you think that you need to protect yourself from your partner because they want ill for you, then we need to be having a conversation about why you're in this relationship. But if overall you think your partner's a good person and they care about you, even if you disagree, but they're a good person and they care about you and like they would never steer you in the wrong way intentionally, then you do not need to act like we're going into World War III every time there's an argument, because you don't need to protect yourself from your partner. You can disagree with them and explain why you disagree without feeling like you need to be defensive and prepare yourself for war. And I think number two is always choosing vulnerability. I think a lot of times we get caught up on like logic and we get caught up on like facts. No, you texted me at 8:05. No, I actually texted you at 8:04. We get caught up on these really superficial, irrelevant details or facts that are not really going to get us anywhere closer to a solution or a compromise or even feeling heard, right? And to counter that, choosing to be vulnerable is the way.
Yes. Great advice. What are some myths about relationships? And I think there were 6 that you had on one of your posts that I saw.
Well, you're testing my memory, which I don't know that I can recall all of them. But I would definitely say that a very common one is like, when you know. And people often say this in reference to people they've been in a relationship with for a long time or someone that they've like chosen to marry. And it was like, oh yeah, like when I met them, I just knew. It was like love at first sight. And I think that's a really common myth, but it's definitely a myth. We can't love someone that we don't know. And if this is the first time that I'm seeing you, I don't actually know you. I am creating a story about you, right? Like I'm picking up information. I now know that you like the NFL because you're wearing the jersey. And there might be little things here and there that you've mentioned that I'm like creating a bigger story for, but I'm creating that story because I don't actually know you, right? So you can't love someone you don't know. Now, you might be very attracted to them. You might like the idea of them. Maybe your friends hype this person up, right? And then you met them and they were cool and there were some things you picked up on and then you created a story and you like that idea of them. And you might be attracted to them, but you don't actually love them. So love at first sight is a myth. And I don't think like when you know, I don't think you wake up one day and you decide this is a person I want to commit to, whether you want to be married or you just want to be in a committed relationship. I don't think you just wake up one day and you know that. I think it's a combination of a lot of little things that happen or don't happen throughout the relationship. And in those little moments, you realize like, wow, no one ever has been this thoughtful or no one ever has, understood me or made me feel heard in this way. Or like, wow, this feels really easy. Like I thought this was maybe going to be a difficult conversation. In the past, it has been a really difficult conversation to have with other people, but with this person, it went really easy. And it's a lot of those little moments in a relationship that eventually when we look back, we're like, oh yeah, obviously I was going to be committed to this person, but it wasn't that obvious. Those little moments had to happen, and we had to notice those little moments to then come to this place of certainty, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Perfect sense.
I think another common one is like, if he wanted to, he would. And I think it's a very popular one, especially when people are dating. And I find a lot of challenges with that one, because I think with that one, we're assuming that other people can read our mind and that other people can interpret our feelings. And this then takes away from the communication, right? So if I believe that someone can read my mind, then I don't have to say what I'm thinking. But then I am going to be perpetually disappointed. They might get it right sometimes. Like, some people are good at reading people. They might get it right sometimes, but they're not going to get it right all the time. And it shouldn't be on the other person to constantly try to decipher what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking and what my needs and wants are. So I think sometimes people want to be loving and want to reach out and want to work and invest in a relationship. They just don't know how to, because we're not giving them that recipe that we talked about earlier today, right? And they just get frustrated when they're trying different ingredients and it's just not panning out. Mm-hmm. So it's not always if he wanted to, he would. I think sometimes our mental health can get in the way. And if we're struggling with like our own insecurities, we're struggling with our own trauma from childhood, we're struggling with like depression, we're struggling with different things, that might also impact the way that we show up. And we might still want to show up, but maybe we're holding ourselves back from showing up because of these other mental health trauma-related factors. So it's not always as easy as if he wanted to, he would. This obviously would apply to women as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Okay, so last question. If you could use your platform to encourage anyone who may be struggling with their mental health or their big emotions or just feeling their feelings, and they're on the fence about talking to someone, a therapist or a coach, or just getting to a point where they're ready to, start their journey, if you will, what would you say?
I would say that therapy is for everyone. And that doesn't mean that you have to be in therapy all your life. But therapy is for everyone. Everyone is going to benefit from therapy at some point in their life. There's no problem that's too big or too small or too trivial for therapy. You can go to therapy to talk about anything. You can unhatch your childhood trauma, or you can go to therapy to talk about how you're super stressed with your job and you want to quit, but you're not ready to quit just yet. You can go to therapy to talk about a relationship that you're feeling ambivalent about and you don't know if you want to stay in this relationship or not. You can go to therapy to talk about how you have test anxiety. You can go to therapy to talk about anything, right? It's you decide what you want to work on in therapy. But there is no issue that's too big or too small for therapy. And anyone and everyone can benefit from therapy at some point in their life. Now, with that being said, therapy is not the only way to work on our mental health and improve our relationships. It's probably the most intimate way and the most personalized, the most individualized way to do that. But it's not the only way. I think there's a lot of psychoeducational ways in which we can do that. So I do believe that knowledge is power. And when we know better, we tend to do better, or at least we make an effort to do better. And so podcasts, self-help books, groups, support groups can be very helpful in achieving some of those goals.
Great advice. I feel like this episode is gold. I feel like we've given so many people so many tools and so much hot topics that a lot of people struggle with. So thank you for that. Thank you for agreeing to do this with me. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure and I had a lot of fun.
If someone wants to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
So on Instagram, I'm the Miami Therapist. And my website, which would have more information if they're interested in working with me as a therapist, it would be healingconnections-therapy.com.
Perfect. All right, Genesis. Well, again, thank you so much for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for who you are, for what you do, and for how you do it.
Thank you for having me. You're very welcome.